whenua. So my name's Dion Pou. A few familiar faces, but I know a lot of you, most of you I don't know. Who am I? I'm an ecologist. I've been working in ecology for about the last 12, 13 years maybe. But I cut my teeth in Australia and then I came home, and that's where I bumped into Manpreet, Jamie, Peter, and everyone else. So he uri o Rahiri ahau, no Ngapuhi ahau, so I'm a Ngapuhi boy. Born and bred, born up in Kaikohe, brought up in Kaikohe, in the Hokianga. So that is my background and that is my whakapapa, and I tautoko. Everything I do is to honour that whakapapa. So for us, that whakapapa is everything. You know, you hear about whakapapa all of the time, you know, that genealogy thing, and you see people wave it around as a bit of a sort of a free kai pass, but actually whakapapa is an obligation. It's not a meal ticket, it's not a ticket into the whare. It's an obligation to look after that whakapapa and everyone connected to you through it, including Papa Tuanuku and Ranginui and Te Mea. So that's sort of the context. So currently I contract to Department of Conservation, to the Ecosystem Research Team, with Jamie, with Ellery, and we've been working towards sort of bringing together these two worlds, which I understand is very topical at the moment. I'm sure most people have heard the kōrero that's been bouncing around the hallways. My kaupapa today really isn't to sort of, I'm keen to have a kōrero, I'm keen to have a conversation, because I find the conversation is where these ideas progress, and we sort of do away with sort of these, often this is about knowledge gaps, you know, and in my experience, if there's a knowledge gap, if there's a hole, it gets filled with crap. So unless you fill it up with some information and some knowledge, that ignorance always breeds rubbish. And so, ka mia atu kia koutou for the opportunity. Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this and sort of, you know, start these kōrero. I'm not a tohunga. I wouldn't ever consider myself an expert in Mātauranga Māori. But you know, if you're brought up Māori, you're actually brought up in Mātauranga Māori. Our worldview, our values, they sort of motivate everything. And a lot of the kōrero recently about Mātauranga and Mātauranga Māori and science, a lot of it's been going straight like that. And it's because we haven't described what is science, we haven't defined what is Mātauranga Māori. And in fact, some of the people involved in these conversations actually admitted as much. They weren't actually conversant with Mātauranga Māori. But to be fair to them, it's a whole culture, you know. So I'm not going to stand up in front of you fellas for half an hour and you're going to know about Mātauranga Māori. Notwithstanding the fact I don't consider myself an expert, but it's a whole culture. So in order to become conversant with it, you know, you really have to commit to it. And so the kōrero I often have to people is that if you really want to understand it, and if you're tūturu, if you're pono, if you really mean it, then engage with it. And that means maybe going out and doing a reo course, maybe going out and doing a tikanga course, you know. Be brave and get out there. I have to be brave all the time. I was having this kōrero with Phil earlier, you know. We put ourselves in these spaces where it's tough for us. It's really hard for us. It's really scary, very scary. For us, what's at stake is our whole identity. Because if we get it wrong, it's the whānau who are kicking us out of the whare, you know, and there's no more, you know, I'd rather face a few bullets than lose my whānau. So that's the sort of risk we put ourselves in. But, you know, we do it so that we can bring you fellas into the whare, and that's what this is about. It's about, I hope, it's about sort of demonstrating. I'm going to talk to our work, because our work is very much founded in this idea of bringing these two worlds together, using that knowledge of both spaces. I guess, nevertheless, we kind of have to enter in a very short discussion about what Mātauranga Māori and science is. So it's a bit hard to talk to you fellas about what science is, because I assume we're pretty conversant with it. Mātauranga Māori is, like I said, it's everything. So it's not just the knowledge generation, it's everything in Māoritanga is interconnected. So that knowledge goes all the way up to our values, up to our worldview. It's all together. So to compare science to Mtauranga Māori is sort of operating at different scales, and it kind of misses if you do that. But it's a whole of world framework. I think it was Hugh Kawharu, I always quote Hugh Kawharu, I don't actually know who made this, it's in the back of my head somewhere, but I'm sure it was Hugh Kawharu. He wrote about, he contrasted these two systems of knowledge generation, Mātauranga Māori being very much systems based, and science being, I don't want to say, it very much hones in on a point, and it generates these dense points of knowledge. But as we sort of get more and more informed and even more knowledgeable, inevitably sometimes we get quite narrower in the scope. So we're very much experts in what we do, but it makes it harder for us to connect. So Hugh Kawharu characterised that sort of process as being centripetal. I don't know if you guys have heard that kōrero before. Whereas in Māoritanga, the first thing we do is, the very first thing we do is the whakawhanaungatanga. That's about making connections. It's about identifying, me telling you who I am. I'm from Taitokiro, I'm a Pou from Kaikohe, and then you fellas can make those connections if they're there. And if not, we generate those connections. And all of our knowledge is systems-based and holistic. It's sort of top-down, really, as opposed to science being sort of at the other end of the spectrum. Sometimes I don't want to generalise too much, but they're very much, Māoritanga is very much centrifugal, is how Hugh Kawharu characterised it, as well as characterising the science as being centripetal. But those are not opposing sort of worldviews. And so with our work, we've sort of been thinking about how do we bring these two worlds together. Sometimes you hear a kōrero about science operating within Mātauranga Māori, and that's very much the perspective we've taken in order to engage with our whānau and our hapu and our haukāinga out in the rural spaces and the urban areas, wherever they are. It's about recognising that framework and then identifying where you sit within that network, essentially, if you want to characterise it like that. I've got up here a bit of an image of a pepeha, in a way. So I don't know how many people are familiar with a pepeha, but in Māori culture, the way we introduce ourselves formally is that I don't just say, hey, my name's Dion Pou, pleased to meet you, sweet as, if we go to the pub. If I'm introducing myself to you, I tell you who I am. And who I am in a Māori context is that whole system, temporally and spatially really, that has made me who I am. I'm not me just because I'm me as a consequence of that system. It's a bit like ecology, we're investigating patterns and points in space and time, but they've been generated by processes. Essentially, that's what I am. I'm a point in space and time that's been generated by the system, if you want to characterise it like that. It's very much a systems level view. So if I was to say, ko puanga tōhara te maunga, ko tahi te awa, ko hokianga nui a kupe te moana, ko Ngāti Pākau te hapu. Puanga tōhara is my mountain, Tāheke is my river, ko hokianga, mighty hokianga is my ocean. I mean, that's essentially a sort of a abiotic sort of foundation, essentially. And then the overlay is ko Ngāti Pākau te hapu. Ngāti Pākau is my hapu. That's my extended family, if you like. That's the social overlay. Everything in Māoritanga, I could, if you gave me a concept in ecology, I haven't hit one yet, but I can't relate to you in Māori terms. And that's sort of been the foundation for our work, is employing those sort of Māori philosophies and principles, and how do we make sense of them in sort of an ecological context and apply our ecological knowledge to generate something that makes sense within Mātauranga Māori and is useful and usable by those communities. Because if the knowledge we're generating isn't leaving something for those communities, it's not Mātauranga Māori. One of the whānau that we work with a lot up north, no Karitu, out of Kawakawa, Peter and James have done mahi with us up there. Chris, Rowan, wherever you fellas are, if you're here or not, they're familiar with Ngāti Manu, and they say, we don't do Mātauranga Māori, there's no such thing as Mātauranga Māori, it's Mātauranga Ngāti Manu. It's place-based. This is place-based. So that is one of the sort of foundations upon which we've built our work, is taking that principle. We're place-based, site-focused, and the way we connect to any point in that landscape is through the whānau, because they whakapapa to that whole landscape. So by connecting to them, not only are we connecting to a point in that landscape, we're connecting to the whole landscape, we're connecting to the social overlay, and te mea nui o te ao, te mea nui o te ao. What's the most important thing in the world? He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. That does not mean people are the most important thing. That does not mean that we're more important than the environment. Because if you take a whole of system approach, that's nonsensical. What it does mean is that we are the ones who affect change. So if you want to get outcomes in the environment, and if you want to understand the whole of system, which is what we use as our context, whatever work we do, we're setting that context and working within that framework. We do that through the whānau. So we connect to them first. And so it's those principles of Māoritanga. It's a whole system approach. It's place-based, and it's about identifying that network and those connections before we start our mahi. So most of our work, our primary focus, I wouldn't say it's our primary focus, but sort of where our work is most advanced at the moment is in Te Atatu in Auckland. That's partly because we started there, but we started there because the opportunity there is so apparent, really. So, actually, I don't have it. So anyway, sorry, it wasn't the slides I thought it was, but they should have them all in there. So that's one part of Te Atatu. Sorry, I wish I had the whole picture there, but basically Te Atatu's in the Waitemata. So for you guys who aren't familiar with Tāmaki Whenua, Auckland, the Waitemata is a major harbour in Auckland, and Auckland's pretty much built around that harbour, more or less. There's a peninsula on the western side of the Waitemata, that's Te Atatu. So it's a sort of a north-south running peninsula. It's, as you can see in the picture there, it's pretty much an urban matrix on top of that peninsula. So like the rest of Tāmaki Makaurau, it sits about 8 metres high, and then there's an escarpment that drops down to the moana, to the ocean. This little bit here is a part of Te Atatu where you've got this incredible diversity of habitat within a very short space. So up the top there you've got that urban background, I guess, running off the hill. You've got, kia ora, thank you, running off the hill, it goes through pastoral space, it goes through recreational park, it runs down into, there's a lower terrace, uniquely in all of the Waitemata, in that ecological district. There is a lower terrace there, and the water ponds at the back, and you get freshwater wetland grading into salt marsh, into the tidal space with the mangroves. Critically for us in our dock work, we've got shenias in there too. Shenias are shell banks that have been formed by, I'm not a coastal processes expert, but I think it's more or less longshore drift, pushing shell banks up. That's a really rare habitat globally, much less in New Zealand. So right through that space into the Waitemata, and actually ultimately out into the Hauraki Gulf, because it's all connected. That's essentially the system we're working with. The beauty of this space is, a lot of people look at this space and their first reaction is, oh, what a shame you got all the houses up there. But that's the kaupapa. That's the beauty of it, is it's got people embedded in that landscape, so that people can be a part of that landscape, not separate from the system, but a part of that system, and they can understand that they are part of that system. That's just an idea of sort of how diverse it is. That's just a slice of the wetland, so you can see how variable it is. That's sort of a conceptual diagram looking from the Waitemata to the peninsula. So on the top of the peninsula, you've got the kainga up there, you've got the houses, we've got the marai's not there yet, but it's about to come. Schools, whatever, you've got the awa running down, you've got the wetland salt marsh thing there, shenias. Any good ecologist will walk in that space and go bang, 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 and link those up, no problems. You know? So there's all sorts of processes in there, it's fantastic. In the middle of Auckland. That space is populated with groups all through that space. They've been there for a while, so yeah, we've got Community Waitaki up the top, so they do engagement with the schools, citizen science. They've been running an education program in there for 3 years. They've got a good slug of funding from Foundation North, and they've got another one, and so that's going for another 3 years. They do Waikea. You guys will be familiar with Waikea, you know, the citizen science water quality testing. They've started some stormwater monitoring. They're doing Waikea in the awa. They're doing it in freshwater. They've started marine metre squared. which often is run on, so it's basically millimetre squared is just transects, transects, citizen science transects in that intertidal space. It's usually on the rocky shores, but here they're doing it in that soft intertidal space. Who else we got? We got forest and bird. They've been doing pest control in there. Birds and zeta are in a couple of spots through there, so there's lots of wading birds, the lot. Kuaka, godwits, knots, both oyster catchers, New Zealand dotterels, banded dotterels, rivals, the mare. So, and I understand someone's been doing some tracking, and some of those have come from down here and landed up there. So that's another part of the corridor, which maybe hopefully I'll get into. But bitterns, fernbirds, the usual, the nice stuff to sort of work with. But it's a really diverse space. But up until very recently, all of those groups were doing their thing in isolation. So even though we understand that landscape is all connected, so there they are in those particular parts of the taiao, of the environment, even though we're all connected, these groups weren't connected. So it was that thing, it was process focused. And it's very much often what we find when we engage with the science, when we come from the science side, is we're process focused. We have areas of expertise, and we'll move into a community and we'll go, we'll tell you about your awa. This is what your awa's doing. And maybe give some information, but how can you know an awa without actually being there for any long period of time? And they certainly, that's fine. But when we go away, they're left with some information about an awa. Someone might come in and they might talk about maybe some rare, I don't know, whatever, it could be invertebrate or whatever. And maybe if they're a lucky community, they're getting all of these points of information, but because it's process focused, you can never build that network. But if you're place focused, and if you build that capacity within the community, you can actually allow them to build that network. And in a Māori context, that's what we understand. We don't understand things in isolation. In fact, that's the exact opposite to Mātauranga Māori. But if you're place focused, you can build that network and do something we think that's actually incredibly powerful. So what we've done now is, I'm a part of the marae community, the marae whānau at Te Atatu. And what we did was about 2 years ago, we have a massive matariki event there. So matariki is part of our maramataka, which is essentially an ecological calendar, which I'll get into in a bit. But we took the opportunity then to bring everyone together, and again, what I'm trying to do is give you a sense of what Mātauranga Māori is. It's about connections and how our culture generates that connection in everything we do. And so what we did was we brought in all of these groups. We said, hey, come and do some presentations at our matariki event. We went, cool, sweet as. It was massive success. We had camera trap footage of bitterns running outside and people were coming in, and it was awesome. But what it was an opportunity for us to go, you see, actually, we're all whānau in this space. We're all connected. Our kaupapa is all connected. You can see how it's connected by virtue of the fact that we're in that space and ecologically they're right side by side. So why don't we work together? So, and that's what's happened. So for the last 2 years we've had what we've called the Te Taiao Network. And what we're about to do now, maybe in about a month and a half, Jamie, is we're looking at running a workshop so that we can actually start integrating all of these kaupapa so that they're practically connected. We're not just standing in a room pissing in each other's pockets. Our mahi actually talks to each other. So one kaupapa that we've talked about, a simple one, is Sustainable Coastlines do litter audits down the bottom of the hill. So they go and engage people with their litter collection, but they also audit, so they're collecting information. So with the stormwater stuff that's very new and we haven't quite started yet, a very simple one would be auditing the litter that's coming down the awa, So if we're collecting information in one kaupapa, how can that kaupapa how can that program connect to and add value to all of the other programs throughout the network? And so essentially what we're generating is a whole of system monitoring and education and engagement framework. And it's very much Mātauranga Māori, because in Māoritanga everything's connected, especially the people. And actually the people who are running this are community. The people who are running this or involved in this are schools. The most important, I come from Ngapuhi, and just to share, I hope I don't get in trouble with this, but to share this whakatauki, he aha te mea nui o te ao. He tangata, he tangata, he tangata. But actually what I was taught was, he tamariki, he tamariki, he tamariki. It's an old Ngapuhi whakatauki. And the most important thing of all is children. If people are the most important thing in the landscape, then the most important thing to people is children. So the most important thing in the world for us is our tamariki. We've got our tamariki engaged in there. We've got all of these community groups that were once all over the place. We've got DOC in there. We've got council in there. Rima are in there. I haven't mentioned the monitoring unit. They've been carrying out intertidal monitoring and water quality monitoring in Waitemata, right adjacent to our space there. So it literally is a whole of system framework, because it's not just connecting up the landscape, it's connecting up that social overlay as well. And then from there, especially with the marae, for us the marae is the nexus of our world. If the world's a network, that marae is where we connect everyone and everything. And so that was the kaupapa at the Matariki. Even though our whare isn't built yet, the kaupapa at the Matariki event was to bring everyone together under the mana of that marae kaupapa. To do what a marae does, to show everyone what we are, and to normalise to them our culture so that they could understand us, and to remove that ignorance, to fill that hole with information. Because prior to that, a lot of these guys were really anti-marae. And again, it's connections. I've got a whanaunga who's I won't mention his name actually, I'm always name dropping, but him, but he's a maramataka expert. He's actually already ahead of us with this stuff. But he works with our whānau Māori. He focuses very much on our Māori communities. He gets out and about, you see him around. Again, I won't mention his name, but maybe at the pub afterwards when Peter and James are shouting me, I might loosen up a little bit. Or maybe you could loosen me up. Hey, just putting it out there. But anyway, so he's amazing. He focuses on our whānau Māori though. This is all of community. So for us, this is about bringing everyone together and connecting. I'm literally scratching the surface with this. You can go wherever you like, because once you acknowledge a few connections, ecologists, we know this, you can go up to whatever. It's about scale. So you can scale up and up and up. And indeed, what we're doing here after this is sustainable coastline. So this is basically a sub-catchment, if you like. It's part of the FO. Sustainable coastlines are now looking at working the whole FO. And so essentially what we perceive as the opportunity is to deploy that. Obviously we're not going to run the whole catchment, but to deploy that up the FO. So you're actually building up to the FO. We're connected to Waipareira Henderson Creek on the other side. Build up there. Big dreams, but thinking up. But it's ecological thinking and it's Mātauranga Māori. So we build up catchment by catchment. The moi moia, the dream is one day we've got all of the Waitemata. And then you do all of the Hauraki Gulf, because the solutions to the paru, the rubbish in the Hauraki Gulf are not out in the Hauraki Gulf. Kapai, dredging is an issue, overfishing is an issue, but the major issue is sedimentation, pollution even. And actually with overfishing and dredging, dredging isn't the problem, it's the people doing it. He aha te mea nui o te ao. So the kaupapa here is to show to people to remove those degrees of separation so that they understand. Instead of just talking to them about it, and they read about it in the textbook, actually they've lived it. So they know the truth of it and they feel the truth of it, because they know that their kainga up there is connected through that network all the way down to the moana. That's Mātauranga Māori, is understanding everything's connected. I gave a kōrero to Forest and Bird recently, and the kaupapa was bringing back nature, and I was like, nature never went anywhere, bro. Nature's still here, we're in it. Maybe bits of it have gone, eh? But nevertheless, it's that sort of, it's the way we think. If anything, if you want to really sort of understand Māoritanga, it's that way of thinking. The first thing we think of is the system. And rongoa Māori, the child, it's that whole burnt hand sort of paradigm, the child's gone and burnt their hand. You fix the hand actually, but what you're addressing is not the hand, that's not the problem, it's the environment. Why has that child burnt its hand? It's an unsafe environment. The whānau always think to that. We had up in Rawene in the Hokianga, they had a myrtle rust kaupapa up there, and we had some of our MPI whānau up there, and there was a few others. It was good kōrero, and they did well actually. But what was really, really insightful is the whānau want to know how that myrtle rust works. But when they were talking about the narrow pathology of that disease, of that rust, the whānau were actually asking, yeah, but what's happening around here? Comes up in the kauri dieback kaupapa as well. What's happened to the system that may have enabled that to happen? They're asking about the context. It's not a singular sort of point and a narrow, even simplistic explanation. They want to understand it in the context of the system. And of course, maybe it is just a simple, 1 + 1 = 2. But that's not how they think. We gave this kōrero on Karitu Marae, Jamie, and we got up and we were talking about this. And I was just saying to you guys last night, when we delivered this kōrero, I felt like a stand-up comic who's delivered the punchline and everyone's waiting. It was like, you're not giving us anything, bro. We know that joke. This is all, for them it's like, so why aren't you doing that already? That's how they think. It's a systems level perspective, and everything about our culture, absolutely everything, comes from that notion that everything is connected. That's the worldview, the values fall out of it, and the tikanga, which in science we often focus on, that comes as a result of the rest of it. The tikanga is like codes of practice. Like I used to be a tradie. So your codes of practice, they're not the only way to do something, but they're there to, they're practices that allow you to be consistent with the law. So they're a good way of doing, if you're a sparky, of wiring up a house and doing it in a way that you're consistent with the law. Good practice, and you're doing it according to the law. That's what tikanga is. It's good practice, and it's consistent with our values. Now, if that practice is no longer fit for purpose, or it's not consistent with our values, tikanga changes. So often in science, we'll go looking for points of information. We'll go to that tikanga. Oh, where did you guys used to go and get your kutai, your mussels? Where did you guys go and so where did the mutton birds sort of land? What were they doing te mea? Those are all really, really valuable insights, and they're all very useful. But for me, what Mtauranga Māori has to offer is that whole of world view. You go into environmental science 101, 201, certainly I know at Auckland Uni, the first thing they're going to say, first thing in the first lecture is, we have a sustainability and biodiversity crisis, and it's because people are disconnected from the environment. Then they go and do their plants up in the Waitakares, they go and do their insects in the hunuas and the laboratory, the marine labs up at Lee. It's all disconnected. This, for me, Mtauranga Māori, this has driven all of our work and our ecological knowledge. This should be intuitive to us in the ecology space for those of us who are ecologists, because it's about connections and systems. And what's the definition of biology? No, not that one. Sorry, Manpreet.
That's all right.
It's
okay.
Got to remember. It's interactions.
Did you want the next slide?
Yeah, I will actually. It's interactions between living things, or amongst living things, and between those living things and their environment. Those are connections. Fundamentally, that's totally philosophically aligned with Mtauranga Māori. So when we're doing our work, if we're just working on a part of the awa, you're actually just one part of that network. And so the kaupapa and the way we do it is to go to whānau, connect to them, understand what their world looks like, what does that system look like. Apply our ecological knowledge. You can do that without stepping on anyone's toes, because we can see the landscape, we know what's going on, and understand that whole of network, and then see what matters to them. And we plug our research into that. And if we're leaving behind useful and usable information for the whānau at place, that's Mtauranga Māori, and that's working within Mtauranga Māori. If you come in with a point of information, but they can't place it in that network, it's much less reduced. It's reduced in its usefulness, its efficacy for the whānau. So I mean, to tautoko what you fellas do, Peter, it's always in the communities, and they do use that information. So that's the kaupapa. If you're leaving behind information for the whānau, that's Mtauranga Māori. That's working with Māori. It doesn't mean you change your question per se, but you just ask, how does the question work for them? Because in Māoritanga we give before we take, So that's the attitude you have to go into these communities with. You give before you take, and what are you giving for them? And in that way you will uplift their mātauranga. For us, the Department of Conservation, where we do our mahi, like Jamie and I, our kōrero is, you build capacity in those communities, like you guys are doing, James, Peter. You build capacity in those communities, they're doing our work for us, because they're kaitiakitanga. Their kaitiakitanga is the most powerful mechanism to realise, that conservation. For us, really, I use this analogy of a car, in science, we're often interested in the bits and pieces, and we're interested in how they come together. That's what our modelling does. We're taking these pieces of information and we're trying to build this picture, we're trying to build that car, kei te pai. And in conservation, it's often like that, There's no people around. That's how it used to be traditionally. Things are changing. And I suspect that's why this Mātauranga Māori is going to become more and more valuable, because that's Mātauranga Māori. It's us in that vehicle driving it, That's the reality. So part of our kaupapa, just to go back a bit, is to take that, and what we're looking to do is to really scaffold up into those communities, and we're looking at the opportunity to really generate some socio-ecological networks, and hopefully maybe even some longitudinal study into how all of these things feed back on each other and work through the system, and where the blockages are, and whatever question. But essentially it is literally a whole of system, socio-ecological, a whole of system network. And we want to get to there. So, one thing, in terms of Mātauranga, there's often this, this kōrero that's gone on recently about Mātauranga Māori and science. And a lot of people have talked about, yes, Mātauranga Māori is science. Like I say, you've got to define the things first before you can really have that kōrero. I shy away from that kōrero because, I don't want to have to validate my culture, my worldview, which, being very conversant with the science, I know has great value. I don't want to have to validate my culture by someone else's sort of yardstick, I mean, it may be true, but the other thing with Mātauranga Māori is it's a whole of system thing. So why would we pull that out to compare it to something that is quite different? So in terms of value, because it's all integrated, because it's connections to everything and everybody, one of our outcomes that we're looking for to connect people to not only our culture but also to their environment is to dive into, just to give one example of the utility of Mātauranga Māori, is maramataka. Maramataka is really, really topical at the moment and getting more and more topical. Maramataka is essentially, it's more than this, but for us, a good way to understand it is it's essentially an ecological calendar. It's an ecological calendar that works the whole system. And for me, maramataka kind of sums up the difference between the Western approaches and the Māori approaches. Maramataka is top down. It's like learning about the car while you're driving it. You in it, moving it around, seeing what it does, understanding what it does, trial and error. It's observational, and it's essentially almost like monitoring, which is what is the network we've got here. So it's the opportunity to build something that incorporates science to generate something that is useful and usable through maramataka at that systems level perspective, where we can drive it and adapt it. So out of that network, one of the outcomes, once you start building that up and start piecing together all of those points of knowledge, what we're hoping to do is to generate a maramataka. Maramataka is built on tohu o te rangi, which is the stars, the moon. So you have your celestial cycles go through the year. That is your timing, and you have lunar cycles within that. And against all of that backdrop is set your ecological indicators, your tohu, essentially. So we would use that network to generate tohu, so that the whānau they don't have to be scientists, but they know that tohu, they know the time of year, they know what to expect, and it's all based on connections between one thing and the other. So a good example is kumara hau. Kumara, people might be familiar with. Kumara hau is Pomaderus kumara hau. Kumara means sweet potato, obviously, and hau means new. So kumara hau is actually a tohu. When it flowers, it signals the time to plant kumara. And it's that sort of thing, that whole of system perspective. It's not necessarily mechanistic like we are in science, where we're looking for cause and effect. It's correlational. And in science, often we don't value that sort of approach. But actually, it's incredibly powerful. and it's a way for the community to engage with their environment and be connected to it. Maramataka is essentially the dashboard, eh? It's the signals, it's the lights and the bells and the whistles that are telling us when we're going too fast, when we need to oil the machine. When we need to maintain the machine, it might even tell us where we're going. And that's the kaupapa. It's whole of system. It's people in it, driving it, responsible for it. I hope that gives you some insight into what Mtauranga is. And obviously, I'm scratching the surface, but like I say, I'm not a tohunga. I don't feel that I have the authority to talk to Mātauranga Māori. Really, you want the real experts for that. But I hope by way of giving some examples, it kind of gives you a sense of actually what the whānau are looking for when you walk into those communities, how they think, how that knowledge system works, and how science can very much plug into that system and uplift it, not take bits out of it. That's not the kaupapa. But for me, it's the pātai and the kōrero, the questions and the kōrero, you know, and that's where the learning is, you know, it's the back and forth. And don't be shy, man, nail me with the nastiest question you've got, man. Like I really don't mind, eh? I've heard it all. You can't be worse than my wife, is all I can say. So, any questions? Jamie, did I forget anything? Sweet ass.
Dion, can I ask you a question? I can also ask later, so maybe I'll ask now or later.
Yeah.
How do you get communities together in the sense that it takes a long time to develop these relationships?
Yeah, totally.
What defines your, I guess your way of going, okay, this is not a now thing, this is a long-term thing. How do you go about relationship building?
Yeah, sweet. Thanks, man. That's a good one. I'll riff on that for maybe 20 minutes, I reckon. Yeah, hard out. So, look, you know, I talked about Doc. You know, if you uplift that community, they'll do your work for you. That doesn't mean you go and dump your problems on them. So it's about capacity building. But they want to do it. That's their kaitiakitanga. So it is long term. That's really what that model is about. So I was focusing a little bit on the ecology, but actually the biggest outcome there, I believe, is the education. So in terms of long-term thinking, for us, we've actually been talking to the school. So it's like kind of not, this is very much what the whānau are after. So there are programs like Te Aho Tūroa, who are like the Māori Enviro School, rather, Enviro Schools are basically the Pākehā version of the Māori Aho Tūroa, Te Aho Tūroa. So it's very much Enviro Schools, but kaupapa Māori. So they're very much in that space. Actually, we're hopeful that that sort of network can, and we're having kōrero with certainly the Te Atatu Kāhui Ako, which is the school cluster, and they are all in for that. And so for us, that's capacity building because it's with your tamariki, you know. So they will, if you give them a maramataka, man, next time they go past, 20 years time they go past and they go, oh, that's flowering a bit later. My kumara aren't growing when I plant it now, or I need to plant it a bit later, whatever. Or maybe, you know, you hear these kōrero, or any of you guys have gone out into those spaces. You've heard all those, you would have heard it a million times, Peter, you know. You hear those kōrero about how things have changed. That's what maramataka allows you to do. It actually gives you the framework to sit those observations in and understand how they change. So it's essentially education and building towards that. I mean, we could go in there and do some research mahi and like, hey, we get heaps of funding and we're in there for 3 years, 5 years, whatever. Then we're gone. That's not the capacity building. The capacity building is with the whānau. So that's our focus. To get to that point, man, just that initial engagement though, which I think maybe you're alluding to as well, it's just, man, it takes as long as it takes. The whakawhanaungatanga is the most important thing, that relationship building. You know, I hear this kōrero all the time and it hacks me off. O hui no tui. The tui's in the hui. You get the hui right, everything else follows. I was saying to Jamie, you know, Jamie first came in the space, he's like, bro, should we do it? And I said, yeah, but just remember, bro, the ecology's easy. It's the people is the hard part. You know, you get that right, everything else will follow. You know, it's the most important part. It's actually the most rewarding part. Up and down, man. Like, you know how it is. But it's the relationship building. Like for us, Doc, going into taitokiro spaces, man, you got a lot of ready to get over. You know, they're not. You're the For some of those whānau, man, you're the enemy. Not that I go, that's why I contract 2 doc. So I don't have that tattooed on it, just so you know. But and total to my mate, to Jamie, man, he puts himself in that space every day. So it does take some bravery, you know. I've seen Jamie grilled in the marae. But then it's just that good heart, and we just keep going because we're doing it for them, you know. But it takes time, and once they understand your pono, tuturu, you're legit, you know, you're there for them, mate, the world's your oyster. You know, some of the relationships were built up home where I'm from, Tai Tokiro. Now we're getting stuff coming at us from everywhere, you know, in those communities. So it actually allows you connect to the whānau, you do genuinely connect to the landscape, and you're leaving something behind. Your science is generating outcomes that are, you know, they're you know, all our science is important, knowledge is important, but you're generating something that those whānau will be using, and you'll be able to see those outcomes in that landscape. Hopefully, that's the kaupapa, hey Peter, is that you'll be able to see something in that landscape, you know, that you've improved everyone's health, I guess, really, and their capacity. Does that make the sense? I mean, me and Jamie, we've been going for like over a year now, and man, we ain't done any science. We've done heaps of kōrero, which I'm ideally suited to, apparently, according to Jamie, so yeah, sweet as. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of you guys get into those spaces very often. Are there many of you guys who insert yourselves in those communities? I think the main thing is just to be, like, if you come with a good heart, they'll read you. I had a mate say to me, bro, I'm really worried. I go into the space, they're gonna he's a Pākehā boy, you know. He's like, oh, I'm worried they're going to do something wrong. I'm like, yeah, you know, that's part of being brave. But you know what, if you go in there with a good heart, it's like, you know, in biology we talk about honest signals. You can't fake them. You don't know you're giving them off, you can't fake them. You go in there with a good heart, you'll be giving off those honest signals. And they'll read it. They'll read it. You know, sometimes you've got to take you've got to duck and weave a little bit. You know. So yeah, is that cool? Yeah.
Dion, what about when the science itself, or the subject of the science, is not place-based?
Yeah.
So, for example, we're studying a species which is throughout Aotearoa.
Yeah.
How do we approach relationship in that context?
Good question. So it's about building that network for us. That's the approach we've taken, is to, like, if you're working on, I don't know, I'll just throw out kukapa maybe, is identifying how that's important to that whānau, what function that has in the landscape and in their culture, and connecting to them through that, so that when you leave that information, it's useful and usable by them, if you know what I mean. So I'll use one that's straightforward, which is, maybe I shouldn't actually, but kukupao. We call it kukupao up north, it's kereru, you know, wood pigeon. You know, that's kind of an easy, straightforward one. That's a taonga species. Maybe I should use another one. Well, actually, so it's placing your work within that network. And that's kind of where we've gone with our mahi, is that those networks don't exist. This is a kōrero I had with Phil before, is that there's actually a lot of work to do on both sides of the fence. And so that network isn't available to plug into. A lot of our knowledge has either been frozen in time at the point of colonisation, or it's been wiped out. A lot of it's been wiped out. So that understanding, that network of how everything works, the practical understanding, philosophically the whānau all know this, you know, that everything is interconnected in their world as a system. What they've lost is those practical understandings to actually apply that. So that's kind of been my kaupapa, really, is to help our whānau regenerate that knowledge in order that then we can come in and populate those nodes within the network. That's essentially the model, is where your piece of knowledge populates a node within that network. So how does it connect to their culture? How does it connect to that wider landscape? What significance does it have to them at place? And that's where the whakawhanaungatanga and the relationship building occurs. Now, to be honest, most places that hasn't happened, and like I say, that network isn't there. And so that's why we're focused on the education, is to try and rebuild that network, to try and rebuild that practical understanding. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg scenario, where how do we plug into something that's not there? So again, that's why we've approached education. So you can still do it. It's still about that whakawhanaungatanga. Why is this important to you guys? How can this be important for you guys? But at the moment it's very hard because we're fighting the effects of colonisation. Does that make sense? I hope that's helpful. Yeah. It's really thinking like an ecologist in a lot of ways. It's landscape ecology, socio-ecological networks. Like I say, I haven't had an ecological concept, even an evolutionary one in some terms, except for the really reductionist stuff, that I can't actually describe in terms of Mātauranga Māori. Even pepehas follow geographic. I use the example with my hapu, like ko tahi ki te awa. But then we've got close relations in the other hapu. They're on the Waimā rivers and Otaua, and they form a branch of the Pūnāki tere. So our little whanaunga, a group of hapu there, we form one part of that catchment. If you scale up to Ngapuhi, we take all the south side of the Hokianga. If you scale up to Waka, ko ngā toki mata whaoroa me Māmari, ngā Waka, ngā toki mata whaoroa and Māmari are our Waka, we share those with our whanaunga on the north side of the harbour, Te Raroa. So actually, as you go up in that network, so I would go ko Ngāti Pākau te hapu, ko Ngapuhi te iwi, ko ngā toki mata whaoroa te Waka. My hapu sits on that river, my iwi sits on the south side of the Hokianga. That Waka is us, Te Raroa, Te Aupauri, and that's all of the Hokianga. You can apply it once you know it. I had a kōrero once we were doing the work in the Warawaras Apito, and in Taitokiro, it's sort of low rolling, sort of a landscape, populated or punctuated by higher relief, so maunga, ranges, Peter. On top of those, there's all sorts of stuff not found everywhere else. In Ngapuhi, we have a tauparapara. It's called Te Wharetapu o Ngapuhi. It's a sacred house of Ngapuhi, and we describe our rohe, our home, according to Rangi Nui is the roof, Papatuanuku is the floor, and then we name each of those big maunga in those ranges all around our rohe. They are the pillars. So the maunga are the pillars, Rangi Nui is the roof, Papatuanuku is the floor. That's the sacred house of Ngapuhi. You go up into a Ngapuhi marae, there's every chance you're going to hear that. But when you take the stuff that, say, Peter and James have been doing, working on those maunga, when you consider those rare species, you can just land that kōrero right in that kaupapa. As those Pou, Te Wharetapu o Ngapuhi, they're holding all of those taonga that, and if you think of it in the context of the glaciations, when things have been going up and down and up and down, and Taitokiro was basically a pātaka, a storehouse for all of that biodiversity. That's where it found its refuge. And you land that kōrero amongst the whānau, you go to, hey man, our sacred house of Ngapuhi is the storehouse for all of that temperate subtropical biodiversity. Without our sacred house, none of this would exist. And some of those things that we whakapapa to, our relations, they still sit up on those Pou and they're found nowhere else. That sense of kaitiakitanga that you bring out of that is enormous, Once you know that stuff, it's ecological. So, look, I always say, if you want to engage with Māoritanga, man, go and do a reo course. Go and do a tikanga course. Reo, man. It's an amazing entry into Māoritanga. My wife's Australian, and I think she's about to go off and do a degree in Māoritanga. The way she's getting into it, personally, it's awesome too. So, I guess that's my best bit of advice, really, is just to get out there. And those reo courses are fantastic. They are very safe space, very warm space. But, ka pai.